Queen Farah's life story is one of both high prestige and profound upheaval, reflecting the dramatic changes that took place in Iran during the late 20th century. Here's an overview of her life. Before we begin, let me tell you about Empress Farah Pahlavi. Born on the 14th of October 1938 in Tehran to an upper-class family, she became Queen of Iran when she was just 21 years old. She was the only child of Captain Sohrab Diba, who lived from 1899 to 1948, and his wife Faride Gotbi, who lived from 1920 to 2000. In her memoir, Farah writes that her father's family were natives of Iranian Azerbaijan, while her mother's family were of Gilak origin, from Lahijan on the Iranian coast of the Caspian Sea. Through her father, Farah came from a relatively affluent background. In the late 19th century, her grandfather had been a diplomat serving as the Persian ambassador to the Romanov court in St. Petersburg, Russia. Her own father was an officer in the Imperial Iranian Armed Forces and a graduate of the French Military Academy at St. Cyr. The young Farah Diba began her education at Tehran's Italian school, then moved to the French Jeanne d'Arc school until the age of 16, and later to the Lycée Razi. She was an athlete in her youth, becoming captain of her school's basketball team. Upon finishing her studies at the Lycée Razi, she pursued an interest in architecture at the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris, where she was a student of Albert Besson. Many Iranian students who were studying abroad at this time were dependent on state sponsorship. Therefore, when the Shah, as head of state, made official visits to foreign countries, he frequently met with a selection of local Iranian students. It was during such a meeting in 1959 at the Iranian embassy in Paris that Farah Diba was first presented to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. After returning to Tehran in the summer of 1959, Mohammad Reza and Farah Diba began their courtship. The couple announced their engagement on the 23rd of November, 1959. Farah married Shah Mohammad Reza on the 20th of December, 1959, age 21. The young Queen of Iran, as she was styled at the time, was the object of much curiosity, and her wedding received worldwide press attention. Her gown was designed by Yves Saint Laurent, then a designer at the House of Dior, and she wore the newly commissioned Noor Olaine diamond tiara. After the pomp and celebrations associated with the imperial wedding, the success of this union became contingent upon the Queen's ability to produce a male heir. Although he had been married twice before, the Shah's previous marriages had given him only a daughter who, under agnatic primogeniture, could not inherit the throne. The pressure for Farah was acute. The Shah himself was deeply anxious to have a male heir, as were the members of his government. Furthermore, Shah's first two marriages had not produced a son, necessary for royal succession, resulting in great rejoicing at the birth of Crown Prince Reza in October of the following year. Farah was then free to pursue interests other than domestic duties, though she was not allowed a political role. She worked for many charities and founded Iran's first American-style university, enabling more women to become students in the country. She also facilitated the buying back of Iranian antiquities from museums abroad. The exact role the new queen would play, in public or government affairs, was uncertain, with her main role being simply to give the Shah a male heir. Within the imperial household, her public function was secondary to the far more pressing matter of assuring the succession. However, after the birth of the crown prince, the queen was free to devote more of her time to other activities and official pursuits. Like many other royal consorts, Farah initially limited herself to a ceremonial role. In 1961, during a visit to France, the Francophile Farah befriended the French culture minister André Malraux, leading her to arrange the exchange of cultural artifacts between French and Iranian art galleries and museums, a lively trade that continued until the Islamic Revolution of 1979. She spent much of her time attending the openings of various education and healthcare institutions without venturing too deeply into controversial issues. However, as time progressed, this position changed. The Queen became much more actively involved in government affairs, where it concerned issues and causes that interested her. She used her proximity and influence with her husband Mohammad Reza to secure funding and focus attention on causes, particularly in the areas of women's rights and cultural development. Farah's concerns were the realms of education, health, culture, and social matters, with politics being excluded from her purview. Farah worked long hours at her charitable activities, from about 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every weekday. Eventually, the Queen came to preside over a staff of 40 who handled various requests for assistance on a range of issues. She became one of the most highly visible figures in the imperial government and the patron of 24 educational, health, and cultural organizations. Her humanitarian role earned her immense popularity for a time, particularly in the early 1970s. During this period, she traveled a great deal within Iran, visiting some of the more remote parts of the country and meeting with the local citizens. Farah's significance was exemplified by her part in the 1967 coronation ceremonies, where she was crowned as the first Shahbanu, or Empress, of modern Iran. It was again confirmed when the Shah named her as the official regent should he die or be incapacitated before the Crown Prince's 21st birthday. The naming of a woman as regent was highly unusual for a Middle Eastern or Muslim monarchy. The great wealth generated by Iran's oil encouraged a sense of Iranian nationalism at the imperial court. The Empress recalled of her days as a university student in 1950s France about being asked where she was from. By early 1978, dissatisfaction with Iran's imperial government was pronounced. By the end of the year, citizens were holding demonstrations against the monarchy. Pahlavi wrote in her memoirs that there was an increasingly palpable sense of unease. Under these circumstances, most of the Shahbanu's official activities were cancelled due to concerns for her safety. Riots and unrest grew more frequent and culminated in January 1979. The government enacted martial law in most major Iranian cities, and the country was on the verge of an open revolution. Mohammad Reza and Farah departed Iran via aircraft on 16 January 1979. The tragic history, and she could never have imagined that the Islamic Revolution would force her and her husband, the late Shah, to flee Iran and live in exile. Farah Pahlavi recalls, "When I think of that morning in January 1979, I feel that heart-wrenching grief again in all its intensity. Tehran had been under savage attack for months, but now a tense silence had fallen over the city, as if our capital were suddenly holding its breath. It was 16 January and we were about to leave the country, for we thought that the temporary withdrawal of the king would help calm the insurrection, and so we left. The decision had been made about 10 days earlier. Officially, we were flying overseas for a few weeks' rest. That was the impression the king wished to convey. Did he really believe it himself? The deep distress I sometimes saw in his eyes makes me think that he did not. I fervently hoped that we were just going for a rest, but I was not entirely convinced of it either. Yet I could not believe that this man who had given 37 years of service to his people would not regain their confidence someday soon. Under his reign, Iran had made remarkable progress. Once peace had been restored, everyone would surely acknowledge the fact. Yes, I was hopeful. It had been snowing. The piercing wind sweeping down from the peaks of the Alborz made crystalline flakes swirl up in the dawn light. The night had been calm, strangely calm, and the king had been able to get a few hours' sleep. Weakened by illness and worn down by the situation, he had lost a lot of weight during the past year. In addition, despite the declaration of martial law, every night protesters had managed to defy the soldiers and climb onto the roofs. We could even hear their shouts of hate in the palace. Every day brought its wave of demonstrations, hate, provocation, and misinformation. The king chatted briefly with his eldest son, making sure, as I did, that none of his own anxiety could be heard in his conversation on the telephone. And yet there were people fleeing all around us. Month after month, more and more business leaders, engineers, researchers, and managers were leaving the country. We would soon be the last legitimate authorities in this sinking ship that certain forces seemed determined to wreck. Those last days before the children's departure had been terrible. At only 8 years old, Layla did not seem to be aware of the dreadful tension we were experiencing, but Farah and Ali Reza, aged 15 and 12, did not hide their uneasiness. During this same period, there was an endless stream of generals, politicians, university professors, and a few clerics coming to the palace to offer their suggestions to my husband. Some advocated a peaceful political solution. Others begged him to allow the army to open fire, to to which the king invariably replied that a monarch cannot save his throne if the cost is the blood of his compatriots. A dictator can, but not a monarch. After initially offering to receive us, the United States had begun to equivocate. It became obvious that we were no longer welcome. Egypt was to be our first destination, but it was far from the children. I was, of course, torn between the hope that perhaps we would come back and the horrifying, humiliating scene already forming in my mind of furious demonstrators entering the palace and opening our drawers and cupboards. I did not want to give them any reason to think that we had left taking our possessions with us. No, we were leaving with heads held high, sure of having worked ceaselessly for the benefit of the country. And if we had made mistakes, at least we had never thought of anything but the general good. When we were informed that the 2 helicopters which were to take us to Mehrabad Airport were ready for takeoff, the palace staff spontaneously gathered on the palace steps. This time we were really leaving. Our bags had already been taken on board. Hands were stretched out to us, and I still can see faces twisted with emotion. The king gave them all a last wave. I kissed the women who were closest to me. With the sound of the whirring rotors in my ears, I soon saw the palace disappear behind the buildings of Tehran. For more than a year, the couple searched for permanent asylum. Many governments were unwilling to allow them within their borders because the revolutionary government in Iran had ordered the Shah and Shahbanu's arrest and death, and it was not known how much it would pressure foreign powers. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who had maintained close relations with Mohammad Reza for years, and whose wife Jahan Sadat was friends with Farah, allowed them to stay in Egypt. They also spent time in Morocco, where they were guests of King Hassan II, and in the Bahamas. When their Bahamian visas were not renewed, they went to Mexico and rented a villa in Cuernavaca near Mexico City during the summer of 1979. After leaving Egypt, Mohammad Reza's health further declined from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In October 1979, the couple was allowed into the United States for medical treatment, inflaming already tense relations between the U.S. government and the revolutionaries in Tehran. The tensions ultimately led to the attack and takeover of the American embassy in Tehran in what became known as the Iran hostage crisis. The Shah and Shahbanu were not permitted to remain in the United States, and shortly after the Shah's surgical treatment on 22 October 1979, the couple departed for Contadora Island in Panama. Both Mohammad Reza and Farah viewed the Carter administration with some antipathy in response to a lack of support. Speculation arose that the Panamanian government was seeking to arrest Mohammad Reza in preparation for extradition to Iran. The Shah and Shahbanu again made an appeal to President Anwar Sadat to return to Egypt. Empress Farah writes that this plea was made through a conversation between herself and Jahan Sadat. Their request was granted and they returned to Egypt in March 1980, where they remained until the Shah's death 4 months later on 27 July 1980. After the Shah's death, Farah spent 2 years in Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat allowed her and the children to stay in the Kubbe Palace. She was the regent in pretense from 27 July to 31 October 1980. A few months after President Sadat's assassination in October 1981, Farah and her family left Egypt. President Ronald Reagan informed her that she was welcome in the United States. Farah continued her charitable activities and also attended the funeral of former U.S. President Ronald Reagan in Washington, D.C. She supports charities, including the International Fundraising for Alzheimer's Disease Gala in Paris. In 2003, Farah wrote a book about her marriage to Mohammad Reza entitled An Enduring Love, My Life with the Shah. The publication of the former Empress's memoirs attracted international interest. It was a bestseller in Europe, with excerpts appearing in news magazines and the author appearing on talk shows and in other media outlets. However, opinion about the book, which Publishers Weekly called a candid, straightforward account and the Washington Post called engrossing, was mixed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel for more fudgy stories updates.